At 12:17 a.m., Alice Graham stood alone beneath the flickering lights of a downtown Cleveland parking garage, staring at a leather wallet thick enough to keep her lights on, pay her overdue rent, and buy the asthma medicine her 9-year-old son desperately needed. Tucked beside the cash was a tiny brass key shaped like a star. She closed the wallet, took a long breath, and drove into the freezing night instead of going home. By sunrise, a black SUV stopped outside her aging apartment building, and the billionaire who owned that wallet stepped out, carrying a question that would change both their lives forever. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. If stories about ordinary people changing lives through quiet courage inspire you, I'd love to have you join us for more. Every weekday began before the sun had even considered rising over Cleveland. At exactly 5:10 every morning, Alice Graham's alarm vibrated across the cracked nightstand instead of ringing. She had changed the setting months ago after realizing that loud alarms always startled Ethan awake, and a child struggling with asthma needed every peaceful minute of sleep he could get. She reached over before the second vibration, silencing it almost instinctively. For a few quiet seconds, she simply watched her son sleeping on the small bed pushed against the apartment wall. His breathing was steady tonight. That alone felt like a blessing. The old radiator hissed in uneven bursts. Outside, January wind rattled the loose window frame. Inside, apartment 3B of a faded brick building on the east side of Cleveland, almost everything had seen better days. The kitchen cabinets no longer closed completely. The linoleum floor near the refrigerator curled upward. The dining table had one leg shorter than the others, balanced with folded magazines underneath. Yet the apartment remained spotless. Every blanket was folded. Every dish was washed. Every school paper Ethan brought home hung neatly on the refrigerator with colorful magnets. Alice believed something she rarely said aloud. Poverty did not have to look careless. She quietly slipped out of bed and walked into the kitchen. The coffee canister was nearly empty. She measured exactly 1 spoonful into the machine. Enough for 1 mug. Enough to wake up, not enough to waste. While the coffee dripped, she opened a small notebook that lay beside the microwave. Every expense was written by hand. Rent, electricity, gasoline, asthma medication, school lunch, laundry. Nothing was estimated. Every dollar had its place. She circled today's date, January 18th. Then she wrote 3 numbers beneath it. Rent overdue $318. Electric bill $168. Medicine refill Friday. She stared at the total for several seconds before closing the notebook. There was no point staring longer. Numbers did not become smaller because someone worried harder. A soft cough came from Ethan's room. Alice immediately walked over. Her son sat halfway up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, sweetheart. You going to work already?" "I've got the diner first." He nodded sleepily. "And school after." "And then my night shift." He frowned. "You'll be tired." Alice smiled. "I've been tired before." She brushed a curl away from his forehead. "What do we always say?" Without hesitation, Ethan answered, "What belongs to someone else can never build our future." She smiled wider. "That's right." It had become their little ritual, not because they often found valuable things, because Alice wanted Ethan to understand something the world rarely taught poor children. Character had to become their inheritance. No bank account could replace it. By 5:45, Alice had dropped Ethan at Mrs. Eleanor Price's apartment downstairs. Mrs. Price was 76, widowed, and still insisted she didn't need help climbing stairs. Alice never argued. She simply carried Mrs. Price's groceries upstairs whenever she happened to run into her. Neither woman ever acknowledged the kindness directly. That was how dignity survived. You working another double today? Mrs. Price asked. Alice nodded. I'm afraid so. You need rest. I need rent first. Mrs. Price looked as though she wanted to say something else. Instead, she handed Ethan a knitted blue scarf. I finished this yesterday. Ethan grinned. Thank you. Alice knew Mrs. Price barely had enough money herself. She also knew refusing would hurt the older woman's pride. So she accepted it with genuine gratitude. Thank you, Eleanor. You'll do the same for someone else someday, the old woman replied. Alice simply smiled. That sentence stayed with her all morning. The diner where Alice worked breakfast shifts stood 3 miles away. By 6:15, the parking lot was already filling. Inside, bacon crackled across flat grills. Coffee cups clinked endlessly. Regular customers occupied the same booths they had claimed for years. Alice moved quietly between tables. She remembered names. She remembered coffee preferences. She remembered whose wife had surgery, whose grandson played football, whose dog had died. People tipped more generously when they felt remembered. By 11:30, her breakfast shift ended. She changed clothes inside the employee restroom. Her second uniform waited in her backpack. Dark gray shirt, company logo, cleaning gloves. She drove her aging silver sedan across town toward Whitmore Financial Tower, where she worked evenings as part of the overnight janitorial crew. The sedan coughed every time she accelerated uphill. The mechanic had warned her months earlier. Transmission problems. Repair estimate nearly $2,000. Alice laughed when she heard the number. She had never possessed $2,000 at one time. Replacing the transmission belonged to another life. At noon, she stopped outside Ethan's elementary school, not to interrupt class, just to leave his lunchbox. He had accidentally forgotten it that morning. The school secretary smiled knowingly. Again, Alice laughed softly. He's 9. He says you're the hardest working mom in Ohio. Alice looked away. Children often believed impossible things about their parents. She hoped Ethan would keep believing a little longer. Across the city several miles away, Charles Whitmore ended an executive meeting inside the top floor of Whitmore Logistics headquarters. The boardroom overlooked Lake Erie through walls of glass. Executives discussed expansion plans worth hundreds of millions, acquisitions, shipping routes, automation, artificial intelligence. Charles listened carefully, but seemed distracted. His fingers rested inside his jacket pocket, touching something. A habit no one questioned anymore. After the meeting ended, Karen Foster remained behind. You seem distant lately. Charles removed a worn leather wallet from his pocket. Inside, tucked behind family photographs and business cards, rested a tiny brass key shaped like a simple 5-pointed star. It looked ordinary, old enough to have little value. Karen smiled. You still carry it. I always will. You've never told anyone why. Charles looked out across the frozen city skyline. My wife gave me this before our first apartment. Karen waited. He rarely spoke about Margaret. We had nothing back then. His thumb gently brushed across the brass. 1 mattress. 2 folding chairs. A borrowed coffee maker. And that key. Karen remained silent. It reminded us, Charles continued quietly, that every door we opened together mattered. He smiled sadly. After Margaret passed away, his voice faded. The key stayed. Karen didn't ask another question. Some grief remained private no matter how many years passed. Charles slipped the wallet back into his pocket before heading downstairs toward another afternoon of meetings. Neither he nor anyone else noticed how loosely the wallet rested inside his coat. Back across town, Alice's evening shift officially began at 4 o'clock. She vacuumed offices, collected trash, polished glass conference rooms after executives had already gone home. Most employees barely noticed the cleaning staff. Alice preferred it that way. Invisible people often heard conversations others missed, yet she never repeated anything. Trust mattered, even when nobody knew they had given it to her. Shortly before midnight, she emptied another recycling bin near the executive parking garage. Her phone vibrated. A notification appeared. Electric service. Final notice. Payment due immediately. She closed the message without opening it. There would be time to worry later. For now, another hallway needed mopping. Another office needed emptying. Another shift needed finishing. Outside snow had begun falling again. And somewhere in that same building, Charles Whitmore was preparing to leave after one final meeting, completely unaware that within the next hour something small would slip unnoticed from his pocket and quietly change the course of 2 lives forever. The last elevator chimed at 11:46 p.m. Its polished stainless steel doors slid shut behind 2 attorneys still arguing over contracts neither of them wanted to think about until morning. Their voices faded down the hallway, leaving only the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet rhythm of Alice Graham's mop moving across marble floors. Night transformed Whitmore Financial Tower into a different world. During the day, thousands of footsteps rushed through the lobby. Coffee cups changed hands, elevators filled with executives and conversations about million-dollar deals echoed through the corridors. After 11 o'clock, the building belonged to people like Alice, security guards, maintenance workers, cleaning crews, people whose names rarely appeared on office directories, but whose work allowed everyone else's mornings to begin in order. Alice wrung out the mop, checked the digital clock mounted above the security desk, and smiled politely at the overnight guard. "Almost done?" he asked. "Just the executive parking level." "You've earned your weekend." She laughed softly. "I'll believe that after my diner shift tomorrow." He shook his head. "I still don't know how you do 2 jobs." "I don't do it forever." "You always say that." "Because one day it'll be true." The guard smiled. Alice always sounded hopeful without sounding unrealistic. It was a rare balance. She loaded her cleaning supplies onto the small cart and wheeled it toward the service elevator leading to the underground parking garage. The temperature dropped immediately. Concrete walls held the winter cold long after sunset. The garage smelled faintly of engine oil, wet pavement, and melting snow carried in by expensive tires. Luxury sedans sat in perfectly marked spaces. Black SUVs reflected rows of ceiling lights. Alice often joked to herself that she cleaned vehicles worth more than every apartment in her building combined. Yet she never envied them. Envy consumed energy she couldn't afford. She emptied a recycling bin beside elevator C, collected several coffee cups abandoned near a pillar, straightened a fallen caution sign. Nothing unusual. Then her phone vibrated. She pulled it from her jacket pocket. Final notice, City Power and Light. Account past due. Service interruption scheduled. Payment required $168.43. Alice closed her eyes for one long second. Not because the notice surprised her, because seeing the exact amount somehow made it feel heavier. She opened her banking app. Checking account balance, $41.82. She smiled sadly. $41. Enough for gasoline. Not enough for electricity. Definitely not enough for Ethan's inhaler refill, due Friday. She slipped the phone away before she could stare any longer. Numbers had never changed because someone wished harder. She pushed the cleaning cart deeper into the garage. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Charles Whitmore stepped out of the executive elevator while buttoning his wool overcoat. His assistant had already gone home. Karen Foster had insisted the remaining reports could wait until Monday. For once, Charles agreed. It had been a difficult week. 2 warehouse accidents, a contract dispute, another acquisition that felt more exhausting than exciting. His chauffeur, Michael Reed, waited beside the company's black Escalade near the private exit. "Long day, sir." Charles smiled faintly. "They're all long days now." Michael opened the rear passenger door. Charles paused. Snow drifted lazily beyond the garage entrance. "It reminds me of '91. Michael knew exactly what he meant. The year Whitmore Logistics nearly collapsed before becoming successful. Neither man spoke again. Charles climbed into the SUV. The vehicle pulled away moments later. Neither of them noticed that something had quietly slipped from the inside pocket of Charles's coat as he sat down. A leather wallet landed soundlessly beside the front tire, where shadows covered the concrete. Several minutes passed. No one walked by. The garage became quiet again. Alice finished wiping down the payment kiosk near the elevator. She checked her watch. 12:17 a.m. Almost home. Almost. She pushed her cart toward the exit when something caught her eye. A dark object lay on the floor several feet ahead. At first she assumed it was another phone case, or perhaps someone's notebook. She bent down. Instead, her fingers touched smooth leather. A wallet. Heavy. Far heavier than any wallet she had ever held. She looked around instinctively. Empty. Only distant security cameras watched silently from the ceiling. Alice slowly opened the wallet just enough to identify its owner. Immediately, she froze. Stacks of $100 bills filled nearly every compartment. She blinked once, then again. She carefully counted without removing them. 1, 2, 3, 9 thick bundles folded together. More cash than she had ever carried in her life. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked around once more. Still no one. No footsteps. No voices. No cars entering the garage. Only silence. Her fingers trembled slightly. Inside another compartment, she found several credit cards. A driver's license. Charles Whitmore. The photograph matched the businessman whose face occasionally appeared on local news broadcasts. Alice had seen him before. Everyone in Cleveland had. Billionaire, philanthropist, founder of Whitmore Logistics. She quietly closed the wallet halfway. Then something small slipped from an inner pocket onto her palm. A tiny brass key. Old, worn smooth with age. Unlike everything else inside the wallet, it looked almost worthless. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't expensive. Someone had drilled a tiny hole through the top decades earlier and attached it to a faded leather loop. Alice turned it over. Nothing. No address. No number. No engraving. Just a small, star-shaped charm beside the key. She frowned. Why would someone carrying thousands of dollars keep such an ordinary key? She placed it carefully back inside. Then reality returned all at once. $9,000. Maybe more. Enough to pay rent. Enough to repair the car. Enough to buy Ethan's medication for months. Enough to breathe. Her phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't a bill. It was Ethan. Alice answered immediately. "Hey, buddy." His sleepy voice filled the quiet garage. "Did I wake you?" "No. You sound tired." "I couldn't sleep." "Breathing okay?" "Yeah." A short pause followed. "When are you coming home?" "Soon." "You promise?" "I promise." Another pause. Then Ethan asked the question he always asked when she worked late. "Did you eat dinner?" Alice looked down at the wallet in her hand. "I did." It wasn't completely true. She had eaten half a sandwich nearly 7 hours earlier. "I'm saving you some cereal," Ethan said proudly. Alice smiled despite herself. "That's very thoughtful." "I know." Another silence. Then he whispered, "I love you. I love you more." After hanging up, she remained standing beside the concrete pillar. The wallet suddenly felt heavier than before, not because of the money, because she knew exactly what that money could solve. No eviction notice, no electricity shut-off, no choosing between medicine and groceries, no pretending everything was fine. Just one decision. No one would know. The garage cameras were old. Security guards rarely watched recordings unless something happened. The owner probably had insurance. He was a billionaire. Would he even notice? The thoughts came quickly. Uninvited? Human? Alice hated herself for even considering them. She leaned against the cleaning cart and closed her eyes. Then another memory surfaced. Ethan at 6 years old. A grocery store, finding a $20 bill near the checkout, his tiny hand proudly holding it up. "Mom, look." Instead of celebrating, Alice had walked him to customer service. The elderly cashier had burst into tears because the money belonged to a retired veteran buying medication. On the drive home, Ethan had asked, "Why didn't we keep it?" Alice had answered without hesitation. "What belongs to someone else can never build our future." Now those same words returned to her, not spoken by her son, spoken by her own conscience. She opened her eyes, looked once more at the tiny brass key, then at the driver's license. Charles Whitmore. She slid everything back exactly as she had found it, zipped her backpack, placed the wallet safely inside, not to keep it, to protect it. She pushed the cleaning cart toward the service closet one final time. Then she grabbed her old coat, picked up her car keys, and headed into the freezing Cleveland night. Home lay 15 minutes east. The nearest police station lay nearly 30 minutes west. Alice turned her steering wheel toward the police station. Her fuel gauge rested just above empty. The fuel warning light came on less than 6 minutes after Alice Graham left the parking garage. A soft amber icon glowed steadily on the dashboard of her aging silver sedan. She glanced at it, then at the nearly deserted streets stretching ahead. "Come on," she whispered to the car, as though encouraging an old friend through one more difficult night. "Just get us there." The heater barely worked anymore. Cold air slipped through the worn rubber seals around the driver's window, carrying tiny flakes of snow that melted on her sleeve. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel and carefully accelerated through another green light. Downtown Cleveland looked almost peaceful after midnight. Office buildings stood dark except for scattered windows, where overworked employees still lingered. Traffic lights changed for roads with almost no traffic. A city bus rolled past, carrying only 2 passengers. Alice's stomach growled. She ignored it. She had exactly $12 in cash tucked inside the visor above her head. If the car stopped now that money could buy a gallon or 2 of gasoline, or a sandwich, or part of Ethan's prescription, it could not buy all 3. She reached over to the passenger seat, where Charles Whitmore's wallet rested inside her backpack. Without opening it, she could almost feel the weight of the cash inside. Enough to erase every bill taped to her refrigerator. Enough to replace the car. Enough to let Ethan stop pretending cereal counted as a special dinner. For one dangerous moment, her imagination betrayed her. She pictured walking into the pharmacy Friday afternoon. "Insurance declined again," the pharmacist might ask. This time she could smile. It doesn't matter. She imagined paying the landlord before another late notice appeared. She imagined taking Ethan to the science museum he had begged to visit for nearly 2 years. She imagined sleeping an entire night without calculating bills before closing her eyes. The pictures arrived effortlessly. Leaving them behind required far more strength. Alice rolled down the window slightly despite the cold. The freezing air cleared her thoughts. What belongs to someone else? She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The rest already lived inside her. The police station appeared at the next intersection. a modest brick building with only 2 patrol cars parked outside. The digital clock on the dashboard read 12:51 a.m. Alice parked near the entrance and looked once more at the fuel gauge. The needle rested almost below empty. She laughed quietly. "If you get me home too," she told the car, "I'll call you a miracle." Inside the station was almost silent. The waiting area held rows of plastic chairs, a coffee machine humming in the corner, and a television mounted high on the wall showing muted overnight news. Behind the reception window sat Officer Daniel Brooks. He looked up from paperwork as the front door opened. "Evening?" Alice smiled politely. "I think I found something that belongs to someone." Officer Brooks glanced at the clock. "Most people finding things wait until morning. I didn't want to." He stepped around the counter. "What did you find?" Alice carefully removed the wallet from her backpack without exposing the contents. His eyebrows lifted immediately. "That's quite a wallet." "I opened it only to identify the owner." "You looked inside." "Just enough to find a driver's license." Officer Brooks accepted the wallet and opened it. His expression changed almost instantly. He counted nothing. He simply saw enough to understand. "You found this where—" She explained the parking garage, the approximate time, the exact location beside the SUV space, every detail she could remember. Officer Brooks listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "You know who this belongs to?" "Yes." "Charles Whitmore." Alice nodded. Officer Brooks looked back at the wallet, then at Alice, then toward the hallway leading deeper into the station. Finally, he sighed. Honestly, he rubbed the back of his neck. "Our evidence clerk won't be back until 7. "I understand." "You could leave your name. I'd rather complete whatever paperwork is necessary." He smiled apologetically. "It'll take a while." "I'll wait." He studied her face for a long second. "Most people wouldn't." "I know." Officer Brooks carried the wallet into another office before returning with several forms. "We have to document everything." "That's fine." He began writing. "Name, Alice Graham." "Address," she answered. "Occupation?" She hesitated. "Cleaning technician?" He looked up. "You mean janitor?" Alice smiled gently. "I clean office buildings." He nodded, appreciating the quiet dignity in her answer. They continued. Time found its own slow rhythm. Every item inside the wallet was photographed, every credit card listed, the cash documented but not counted by hand until another officer arrived to witness the inventory. Alice waited patiently. No complaints, no sighs. At one point, Officer Brooks looked over. "You can sit." "I'm okay. You've had a long day." "I still have tomorrow." That answer somehow stayed with him. Around 1:30 a.m., another officer entered carrying fresh coffee. He glanced toward Alice. "She's still here." Officer Brooks nodded. "Found Whitmore's wallet." The other officer whistled softly. "No kidding." He looked toward Alice. "You know there was enough cash in there to change somebody's life," Alice answered calmly. "It wasn't mine." The room fell quiet. Neither officer spoke for several seconds. Eventually, Officer Brooks cleared his throat. "I appreciate you bringing it in." Alice simply nodded. When the paperwork was nearly complete, Officer Brooks frowned. "We've got one problem." "What is it?" "I can't officially release the property until the owner is contacted." "That's fine." "He probably won't answer until morning." "I understand." "No, I mean—" He glanced toward the clock. "You don't actually have to stay." Alice looked surprised. "I don't—" "No." I thought I needed to. We've got your statement. You can go home. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you. As she gathered her backpack, Officer Brooks called after her. Miss Graham. She turned. Most people would have taken the money. Alice smiled with quiet honesty. I thought about it. The admission caught him off guard. She continued before he could respond. I just couldn't imagine teaching my son honesty tomorrow if I stole from someone tonight. Officer Brooks didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched her walk toward the exit. The automatic doors slid open. Cold air rushed inside. Alice disappeared into the snowy darkness. He remained standing there longer than necessary. Finally, he looked toward the ceiling. A small security camera overlooked the reception desk. It had captured every minute of their conversation, every form, every hesitation, every opportunity Alice had to walk away before surrendering the wallet. He picked up the phone. Dispatch. This is Brooks. When Mr. Whitmore is notified in the morning, he paused. Tell whoever contacts him that I recommend they request the station security footage, too. Why? Brooks looked once more towards the empty doorway where Alice had left. Because sometimes paperwork tells you what happened. He smiled faintly. And sometimes people do. Outside, Alice climbed back into her sedan. The engine hesitated. Once, twice. Then finally started. She whispered another quiet thank you to the stubborn old car. Snow continued falling as she drove home. She had no idea that several cameras, those in the parking garage, the streets she had crossed, and now the police station had quietly recorded one ordinary woman making an extraordinary choice. By sunrise, those recordings would be viewed by exactly one man, and they would change far more than his opinion of humanity. At 6:42 the next morning, Charles Whitmore reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat as he stepped out of the elevator on the top floor of Whitmore Logistics headquarters. His hand found nothing. He frowned. Without breaking stride, he checked the other pocket, then his briefcase, then the pockets of his trousers. Nothing. He stopped walking. Karen Foster, who had just caught up with him carrying a stack of reports, immediately noticed the change in his expression. What is it? Charles searched again, slower this time, as though the wallet might appear if he looked carefully enough. My wallet. You left it in your office. I never leave it. Karen set the reports on a nearby table. When did you use it last? Charles replayed the previous evening in his mind. The board meeting, the elevator, Michael opening the SUV door, the drive home. Dinner he barely touched. No, he hadn't opened the wallet since before leaving the building. His stomach tightened. Karen reached for her phone. I'll call security. Charles nodded distractedly. His concern wasn't visible in his face, but Karen had worked with him for nearly 12 years. She knew the difference between a businessman worried about money and a husband afraid of losing something irreplaceable. This isn't about the cash, is it? She asked quietly. He looked out the glass wall toward the frozen lake. No. The key? And Margaret's note. Karen lowered her eyes. She had seen the folded note once years earlier when Charles accidentally dropped the wallet during a charity dinner. He had picked it up with surprising urgency. Later, he had explained. Margaret had written the note on the morning they moved into their first apartment. It contained only one sentence. Never let success lock the door behind you. Charles had carried that note every day since her funeral. No copy existed. The paper had yellowed with age. Its corners had softened from decades of careful handling. Losing money would be inconvenient. Losing that note felt like losing Margaret all over again. Karen called downstairs. Within minutes, the security office confirmed no wallet had been turned in overnight. She contacted the valet staff. Nothing. The cleaning supervisor. Nothing. The parking garage attendants. Nothing. Charles stood silently beside the window while each answer arrived. No. No reports. Nothing found. Karen finally said, "Let's review the security footage." The head of building security, Victor Hale, arrived carrying a tablet. "We've already started checking." "Show me." Victor tapped the screen. The first camera displayed Charles leaving the executive elevator. Another showed him walking across the lobby. Another captured him entering the underground garage. The timestamp read 11:58 p.m. Charles watched himself greet Michael before climbing into the SUV. Victor slowed the footage. "Right here." Everyone leaned closer. As Charles sat down, the corner of the leather wallet slipped halfway out of his coat pocket. When he adjusted himself in the seat, gravity did the rest. The wallet slid silently onto the concrete. Neither Charles nor Michael noticed. The SUV drove away. The wallet remained alone beneath the harsh garage lights. Victor fast-forwarded. Minutes passed. Several employees walked through the area. None noticed it. At 12:17 a.m., another figure entered the frame. Alice. She pushed a janitorial cart while wearing reflective gloves and carrying a mop bucket. Charles watched her stop. Bend down. Pick up the wallet. His breathing slowed. Victor glanced toward him. "This is where we usually lose them." Charles said nothing. On screen, Alice looked around the empty garage. She opened the wallet. Charles could almost predict what she was seeing. The money, the cards, the note, the key. She remained still for nearly a minute. Karen folded her arms. "No one else is around." Victor quietly added, "Camera coverage has blind spots near the west exit." Charles understood exactly what that meant. If she chose to leave, no one would likely stop her. The video continued. Instead of walking toward the garage exit, Alice stood motionless. She closed the wallet, opened it once more, looked again at the identification. Then she placed it carefully into her backpack. Victor paused the recording. "There." Charles looked at him. "She left with it." Karen spoke before Victor could continue. "Let him finish." Victor nodded and resumed playback. The next camera showed Alice returning her cleaning equipment. Clocking out, leaving the building. Charles expected the footage to end. Instead, another camera appeared. Street intersection 12:29 a.m. Alice's old silver sedan turned left. Victor enlarged the map. "That's interesting." Karen looked confused. "Why?" "Home is east?" He highlighted the route. "She's driving west." Another traffic camera appeared. Another. Each showed the same old sedan moving steadily through the sleeping city. Charles leaned forward. "Where is she going?" Victor zoomed farther out. "The 4th Precinct." Silence settled across the room. The next recording came from the police station entrance. Timestamp 12:51 a.m. Alice parked. Walked inside carrying her backpack. She remained there, 1 o'clock, 1:15, 1:30, 1:42. Finally she emerged, without the backpack appearing as full as before. She got back into her car and drove away. Victor looked toward Charles. "I received a call from Officer Daniel Brooks about 20 minutes ago." Karen blinked. "He called you?" "He asked us to contact Mr. Whitmore as soon as possible." Victor handed Charles a printed report. "The wallet is waiting at the station." Charles accepted the paper, but did not read it. His eyes remained fixed on the paused image of Alice walking into the station. Snowflakes drifted around her. Her coat looked far too thin for the weather. Her car looked older than some of the forklifts in the warehouse. She had every reason not to make that drive. Yet she did. Victor spoke again. "The officer also suggested you watch one more recording." He switched to the station's reception camera. There was no sound, only black and white footage. Alice standing patiently, Officer Brooks inventorying the contents, more paperwork, more waiting. Almost an hour passed on screen. At one point, the officer gestured toward the chairs. Alice smiled and remained standing. Another officer entered carrying coffee. The three spoke briefly. Then Alice prepared to leave. Victor finally turned off the tablet. The officer said she refused to leave until every item had been documented. Karen quietly exhaled. Charles remained silent. He had spent the last 20 years surrounded by negotiations, contracts, lawyers, financial incentives, performance bonuses. He had learned that nearly everyone had a price. Watching Alice Graham on those recordings unsettled that belief. Not because she had returned the wallet, because she had done so without anyone watching, or at least believing no one was watching. He looked down at the report again. Alice Graham, cleaning technician, address, East Cleveland. No awards, no headlines, no social media campaign, just a name. Karen broke the silence. What would you like to do? Charles folded the paper carefully. First, he smiled for the first time that morning. I'd like my wife's note back. 40 minutes later, he walked into the 4th precinct. Officer Daniel Brooks greeted him personally. Mr. Whitmore. Officer? Brooks placed the leather wallet on the counter. Charles picked it up almost reverently. His fingers immediately opened the familiar compartment. The folded note remained exactly where it belonged. Behind it rested the tiny brass key. He closed his eyes for a brief second. Not because he was relieved about the money, because something he thought was gone forever had returned intact. When he looked up, Officer Brooks was watching him. She never asked for a reward, Brooks said. I know. She never even asked if there was one. Charles nodded slowly. Did she say anything? Officer Brooks smiled faintly. Actually, he remembered Alice standing beneath the reception lights, exhausted after nearly 18 hours of work. She said something I don't think I'll forget. Charles waited. Brooks repeated her exact words. I just couldn't imagine teaching my son honesty tomorrow if I stole from someone tonight. The sentence lingered in the room long after the officer finished speaking. Charles looked once more at the worn brass key resting inside his wallet. Then he closed it carefully and slipped it back into his coat. Officer Brooks? Yes, sir. I'd like the address from her statement. Brooks hesitated for only a moment. I believe she'd appreciate a thank you. Charles smiled. So would I. But deep inside, he already knew he wasn't driving to Alice Graham's apartment to offer a reward. He was going because after years of wondering whether people like Margaret still existed in the world, he had finally found someone who reminded him they did. By the time Charles Whitmore's black SUV turned onto Maple Avenue, the winter sun had climbed just high enough to paint the snow with pale gold. The neighborhood looked nothing like the places where business executives usually held breakfast meetings. Small brick apartment buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, paint peeled from old porches. A corner grocery displayed handwritten sale signs in its window. Children bundled in oversized coats waited for school buses, while parents hurried toward hourly jobs. Michael Reed slowed the SUV. This should be Building 14. Charles looked through the tinted window. Apartment 3B. The address from Alice Graham's statement. He had expected many things. He had not expected this. A rusted bicycle leaned against the front stair railing. Someone had patched a broken window with clear plastic. An elderly man shoveled snow from the sidewalk in front of his own apartment, while stopping every few minutes to catch his breath. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested comfort. Everything suggested people surviving 1 month at a time. Michael parked. You want me to come with you? Charles shook his head. I'll handle this. He stepped out into the cold, carrying only his wallet. Inside it rested the folded note from Margaret, the tiny brass key. Everything Alice had protected. As he climbed the stairs, laughter drifted from somewhere inside the building. A child. Then the sound disappeared behind another closing door. Charles knocked gently. Inside, apartment 3. B. Alice had barely managed 4 hours of sleep. She had arrived home shortly after 2:30 in the morning. By 6, she was already making oatmeal before Ethan's school day began. The knock surprised both of them. "Were you expecting someone?" Ethan asked. Alice shook her head. "No." She opened the door. Standing on the landing was the last person she expected to see. Charles Whitmore removed his gloves. "Miss Graham?" She stared for a moment before recognizing him from the driver's license photograph. "Mr. Whitmore. I hope I'm not interrupting." For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Alice stepped aside. "Please, come in." Charles entered quietly. The apartment was modest, very modest, but spotless. No expensive furniture. No decorations trying to imitate wealth. Only careful organization. Everything had a purpose. His eyes naturally wandered. A bookshelf filled with children's library books. A sewing kit beside the sofa. A stack of unpaid envelopes held neatly together with a rubber band. Nothing looked neglected, only stretched. Ethan walked into the living room carrying his bowl of oatmeal. He stopped immediately. His eyes moved from the stranger to his mother's face. "Mom?" Alice smiled. "Oh, Ethan. This is Mr. Charles Whitmore." The boy's eyes widened. "The truck company." Charles laughed softly. "We have a few trucks. My class visited one of your warehouses." "Did you?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "They let us sit in the driver's seat." Charles smiled. "I'm glad." Alice looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, he talks a lot." "I like children who do." An awkward silence followed. Charles reached into his coat. Alice immediately assumed he wanted his wallet back. Instead, he held it with both hands. "I came to thank you." "You don't have to." "I do." He placed the wallet on the kitchen table. "You returned something that means more to me than you could possibly know." Alice looked at the familiar leather. "I only returned what belonged to you." Charles slowly opened it. He removed the tiny brass key, then unfolded the worn piece of paper. Even from where she stood, Alice could see the careful handwriting. "My wife wrote this 32 years ago." Alice remained silent. "We were moving into our first apartment." He smiled gently at the memory. "We owned almost nothing." He handed her the folded note. She hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I'd like you to read it." Alice carefully accepted the fragile paper. The handwriting was elegant. Only one sentence. "Never let success lock the door behind you." She looked up. "It's beautiful." Charles nodded. "I've carried it every day since she died." Alice folded the note exactly as she had received it and returned it with both hands. "I'm glad it found its way home." "So am I." Ethan looked curiously at the tiny brass key. "What does the key open?" Charles turned it between his fingers. "It opened our first apartment." "It still works." "No." "Then why keep it?" Charles smiled. "Because sometimes the door matters less than what happened after you walked through it." Ethan seemed to think about that very seriously. "I like that." Charles looked around the apartment again. He noticed patched sleeves on Alice's winter coat hanging near the door. The old space heater humming beside the sofa. The careful way every expense had obviously been managed. He also noticed something else. No complaints, no bitterness, only quiet dignity. He reached into another pocket and removed an envelope. "I know you'll probably say no." Alice already suspected what it contained. Mr. Whitmore, please. She accepted the envelope without opening it. Inside rested a cashier's check. $50,000. My family and I owe you more than thanks. Alice looked at the amount, then looked back at Charles. Her eyes widened for only an instant before becoming calm again. She gently slid the envelope back across the table. I can't accept this. Charles blinked. You haven't even thought about it. I already have. It could change your life. It isn't mine. It isn't charity. It's gratitude. Alice shook her head. You don't owe me $50,000. I decide what gratitude looks like. And I decide what kind of example I leave my son. The room became quiet. Ethan looked from one adult to the other without understanding everything they meant. Charles tried again. Then think of it as a reward. Alice smiled kindly. If my son ever loses something precious, she glanced at Ethan before finishing. I hope the person who finds it doesn't ask how much it's worth before returning it. Charles felt the words settle heavily inside him. She wasn't refusing because she disliked money. He could see the overdue notices stacked on the counter. He could hear the old heater struggling. He could almost feel how desperately that check could help. She was refusing because accepting it would change the meaning of what she had done. He slowly picked the envelope back up. I've spent a long time believing integrity was becoming rare. Alice answered quietly. It isn't rare. It just isn't loud. Charles laughed softly. No. It usually isn't. For the first time that morning, both smiled naturally. Ethan broke the silence. Mom says doing the right thing is supposed to feel normal. Charles looked at him. Does it? Mostly. The boy shrugged. Sometimes it's hard first. Charles laughed again. Really? I think your mother has taught you well. I think so too. A school bus honked outside. Alice glanced at the clock. Oh. She grabbed Ethan's backpack. We're going to miss the bus. Charles stepped aside as Ethan hurried toward the door. Just before leaving, the boy turned back. Mr. Whitmore. Yes. I'm glad you got your key back. Charles looked down at the tiny brass key resting in his palm. So am I. After Ethan left for school, silence returned. Charles looked once more around the apartment. An idea had begun forming long before he reached the building. Now it became impossible to ignore. He slipped the envelope back into his coat. Miss Graham. Alice is fine. Alice. He paused. I won't insult you by trying to buy your honesty. She nodded appreciatively. But I hope you'll allow me to do something else. Alice tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Charles smiled. I'd like to ask you a question. It wasn't the question she expected, and the answer would begin changing both of their futures. After leaving Alice Graham's apartment, Charles Whitmore did not return directly to headquarters. Instead, he asked Michael Reed to drive without a destination. The black SUV moved quietly through Cleveland's morning traffic while Charles stared out the window. Construction crews repaired sidewalks. Teachers guided children across crosswalks. Delivery trucks unloaded groceries. Ordinary people began ordinary days. He found himself wondering how many acts of quiet integrity happened every morning without anyone noticing. Finally, he broke the silence. Michael. Yes, sir. How long have you worked for me? 19 years. Charles smiled faintly. You've seen a lot. I've tried not to see too much. That answer earned a quiet laugh. Tell me honestly. Michael glanced briefly into the rearview mirror. About what? If you found a wallet with $10,000 inside, he paused. What would you expect from the person who returned it? Michael thought carefully. I'd expect them to accept a reward. And if they refused, I'd wonder what mattered more than money. Charles nodded. So am I. The conversation ended there, but the question stayed with him. Back at Whitmore Logistics headquarters, Karen Foster was already waiting with a folder. I thought you'd be at the station. I was. And Charles placed the wallet on his desk. Everything was there. Karen smiled with relief. I'm glad. So am I. He sat down, then looked toward the framed photograph of Margaret standing beside one of the company's first delivery trucks. We offered her $50,000. Karen blinked, and she refused. Karen slowly lowered the folder onto the desk. She refused. Charles nodded. Completely. What reason did she give? He repeated Alice's words. If my son ever loses something precious, I hope the person who finds it doesn't ask how much it's worth before returning it. Karen remained silent for several moments. Finally, she smiled. I think Margaret would have liked her. Charles looked again at the photograph. I think so too. He opened the folder Karen had brought. Instead of quarterly financial reports, he found personnel documents. What are these? You asked me once to tell you whenever I met someone with unusual character. Charles looked up. I did. I think you've met one. He smiled. I've already noticed. Karen leaned forward. If you're thinking about offering her a position? I'm thinking. Then I'd recommend knowing more before making any decision. Charles nodded. Agreed. He pressed the intercom. Could someone ask Ryan from corporate security to come upstairs? 10 minutes later, Ryan Coleman entered the office. He was 38 efficient and known for conducting background investigations before senior executive appointments. You wanted to see me? Charles handed him a single sheet of paper. Alice Graham's name and address. I need a background review. Ryan glanced at the page. Criminal. No. Financial, no. What exactly are we looking for? Charles considered the question. The truth. Ryan looked puzzled, but nodded. I'll start immediately. By late afternoon, the first report began taking shape. There were no criminal records, no lawsuits, no bankruptcies. Credit history showed years of financial struggle, but consistent payments whenever possible. Employment records revealed something unexpected. Alice had worked for 6 different employers during the previous 12 years. Every supervisor described nearly the same person. Reliable, never late, honest, quiet. One former grocery manager laughed during Ryan's phone interview. You asking whether I'd hire Alice again? In a heartbeat. Why? Cash register came up $40 over one night. What happened? She found the mistake after closing. Kept it. The manager laughed harder. She drove back at 10:30 because she couldn't sleep knowing the books were wrong. Ryan made another note. The next employer shared another story. Alice had once discovered an elderly customer's prescription medication left inside a shopping cart. Instead of leaving it at customer service, she drove nearly 40 minutes after work to deliver it because the address appeared on the pharmacy label. Another supervisor remembered something different. When the restaurant accidentally overpaid everyone's holiday bonus, Ryan interrupted. She returned it. Before I even realized the accounting mistake. By evening, a pattern had emerged. Not one extraordinary event, many small ones, each insignificant by itself. Together they described a life built on consistent choices. Ryan continued digging. He visited the apartment building. The landlord answered reluctantly. Alice Graham. Ryan nodded. What kind of tenant is she? Always behind. Ryan wrote something. The landlord quickly added, but never dishonest. What do you mean? If she's going to be late, she tells me before I ask. He shrugged. I've rented apartments 30 years. Most people hide. She doesn't. Ryan thanked him and continued. Downstairs, he met Mrs. Eleanor Price carrying groceries. I can help, Ryan offered. The elderly woman smiled. Young man, if you carry one bag, Alice will scold me for making strangers work. You know Alice well, Mrs. Price laughed. Half this building does. What kind of neighbor is she? The old woman's expression softened. When my arthritis got bad. She looked toward the stairway. She started carrying my groceries. Every week, Mrs. Price shook her head. Every time. Did you ask? No. Does she charge you? The elderly woman looked almost offended. Of course not. Ryan noticed several flower pots outside Mrs. Price's door despite the winter. Those flowers? Alice planted them last spring. And waters them. Ryan continued writing. Anything else I should know? Mrs. Price smiled. You should ask who shoveled my sidewalk during last month's snowstorm. Alice. No. Ethan. The boy. His mother says helping people starts before you're old enough to think you're generous. Ryan thanked her and returned to headquarters. That evening, Charles and Karen reviewed every page together. There were no dramatic headlines, no viral stories, no newspaper articles. Just ordinary moments, repeated over many years. Returning extra change, helping neighbors, volunteering quietly at Ethan's school carnival, cleaning after community events without anyone asking, keeping promises. Charles closed the folder. Interesting. Karen nodded. What? None of these stories involve large sacrifices. Charles smiled. Exactly. She waited. Character isn't usually revealed by one enormous decision. He tapped the folder gently. It's revealed by hundreds of ordinary ones. Karen thought about Alice standing inside that small apartment. Then returning your wallet wasn't unusual for her. Charles shook his head. It was perfectly normal. The realization affected him more deeply than he expected. At the same moment across town, Alice was beginning another shift at the diner. Nothing about her day had changed. She still refilled coffee, still carried heavy trays, still smiled politely at customers. She had no idea that executives were discussing her in a boardroom, no idea that someone was interviewing former employers, no idea that her entire life was quietly being examined. She simply continued being herself. Near closing time, one customer accidentally left a wool scarf hanging over the back of a chair. Another waitress picked it up. Lost and found. Alice looked toward the door. He just left. Without hesitation, she hurried outside. Snow had started falling again. The customer had already reached his car. Sir, the man turned. You forgot this. He looked surprised. I didn't even realize. He accepted the scarf gratefully. Thank you. Alice smiled. Drive safely. Inside the restaurant, the younger waitress watched through the window. When Alice returned, she laughed. You know? What? You probably save more lost things than anyone I've ever met. Alice smiled as she picked up another coffee pot. I just don't think they belong to me. Miles away, Charles Whitmore read the last page of Ryan's report. Then he looked once more at Margaret's note inside his wallet. Never let success lock the door behind you. Slowly, an idea began forming. Not a reward, not charity. Something far more meaningful. If Alice Graham's greatest strength was her character, perhaps the opportunity she deserved was one that allowed that character to influence far more people than just her son. He closed the report. Tomorrow he would ask her a very different question, and this time it would have nothing to do with money. Alice Graham expected Charles Whitmore's question to involve another reward. Instead, he surprised her. I'd like to offer you an interview. She blinked. I'm sorry. Not for charity. Charles spoke calmly, choosing every word with care. For work. Alice looked genuinely confused. I clean offices. I know. I've never managed a company. I'm aware. I don't have a business degree. Charles smiled. I know that too. Alice folded her arms instinctively. Then why me? Charles glanced toward the kitchen table, where the folded grocery list, Ethan's school calendar, and a notebook full of carefully planned expenses rested in perfect order. I've spent 35 years hiring people with excellent resumes. He looked back at her. Character is much harder to find. She shook her head. I appreciate that, but honesty doesn't qualify someone to run a business. No. He agreed immediately. It doesn't. She waited. But it gives them something I can't teach. What? The instinct to do the right thing when nobody's watching. Silence settled between them. Charles continued. We can teach inventory systems. We can teach scheduling. We can teach operations. He smiled. We've spent millions teaching those. What we can't teach is the decision you made at 12:17 in the morning. Alice lowered her eyes. I only returned a wallet. You revealed who you are. She didn't know how to answer. Charles reached into his briefcase this time and removed a slim folder. This is not a job offer. She accepted it cautiously. Then what is it? A paid management training program. Alice looked at the first page. Whitmore Logistics Leadership Development Program. Duration 6 months. Full salary, benefits, training, mentorship, guaranteed evaluation. She looked back up. This has to be for college graduates. It usually is. And I'm not one. No. Charles smiled. You aren't. So why would you change the rules? He answered without hesitation. Because sometimes rules are designed to find experience. He paused. And sometimes they accidentally overlook wisdom. Alice laughed softly in disbelief. I think you're giving me far too much credit. I don't. She looked again at the paperwork. The salary alone exceeded what she earned from both jobs combined. Enough to pay rent, enough to repair the car, enough to refill Ethan's prescriptions without counting every dollar. It wasn't a gift. It was employment. Somehow that made the decision even harder. I don't know anything about logistics. Charles nodded. Then you'll learn. I might fail. So might anyone. I've never even worked in an office. I know. She looked almost overwhelmed. This doesn't make sense. Charles leaned back slightly. It didn't make sense when people invested in me either. That caught her attention. He continued quietly. I was 26. My business was losing money. Every bank rejected me. Everyone except one retired warehouse owner. What happened? He loaned me enough to survive. Alice smiled. Why? He said something I've never forgotten. Charles looked toward the window. I can replace money. I can't replace the chance to believe in the right person. The room grew quiet again. Alice slowly closed the folder. I need time. I expected that. I can't answer today. I wouldn't want you to. He stood. Take the weekend. I'll have Karen Foster call Monday morning. He walked toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. Alice looked up. If you say no, he smiled warmly. I'll still be grateful you returned my wallet. After he left, Alice remained standing in the living room for several minutes. The apartment suddenly felt much smaller than before. The folder rested on the table like something from another life. Mrs. Eleanor Price knocked gently 20 minutes later. I saw a fancy SUV. She smiled knowingly. Everything all right? Alice invited her inside. Instead of explaining, she handed over the folder. Mrs. Price adjusted her reading glasses. As she read, her eyebrows climbed higher. My goodness. I know. They're offering you this. Apparently. The elderly woman sat slowly. Why are you worried? What if they're wrong? About what? About me. Mrs. Price looked directly into her eyes. Alice, when you first moved into this building, you had one chair, a mattress, and a little boy who cried every night because he missed his father. Alice remained silent. You still found time to help everyone else. She smiled gently. If they think you can learn something new, I believe them. That afternoon, Alice picked Ethan up from school. He immediately noticed something different. You've been thinking, she laughed. Is it that obvious? You bite your lip. I do. Only when something important happens. She smiled. I guess you're paying attention. They walked home through fresh snow. Halfway there, Ethan noticed she was unusually quiet. What happened? Alice explained everything. The wallet, the visit, the interview, the training program, the possibility of leaving the diner and janitorial work. Ethan listened without interrupting. Finally, he asked, Do you want it? I don't know. Why? What if I'm not good enough? The boy frowned. You always tell me something. What? We don't decide if we're good enough before we learn. She stopped walking. When did I say that? When I couldn't ride my bike. She laughed despite herself. I forgot. I didn't. They continued walking. After another block, Ethan spoke again. You know what I think. What? I think Mr. Whitmore isn't giving you a job because you returned his wallet. No. I think he already trusted you. Alice smiled. What makes you say that? He gave you homework instead of money. She laughed out loud. I never thought of it that way. That evening, she spread the documents across the kitchen table. Every page looked professional, detailed, demanding. Warehouse rotations, leadership classes, operations training, financial planning, team management, performance reviews. It all felt intimidating. One requirement caught her eye. Each trainee would spend time in every department before moving into leadership. No shortcuts, no special treatment. She appreciated that. If she accepted, she wanted to earn whatever came next, not receive it because of one honest decision. Late that night, she called the diner manager. Frank, everything okay? I might need to adjust my schedule next month. Found another cleaning job? She smiled. Maybe something different. Frank laughed. Whatever it is. You deserve a break. After ending the call, she opened the small notebook where she usually tracked expenses. Instead of writing numbers, she wrote one question across the top of a blank page. Am I afraid of failing, or afraid of becoming someone new? She stared at the sentence for a long time. Across town, Charles sat alone in his office. Karen entered, carrying Monday's meeting schedule. Think she'll accept? Charles looked toward the city lights beyond the window. I honestly don't know. Karen smiled. Most people would have accepted before you finished explaining the salary. I wasn't looking for most people. She nodded. No. You weren't. Charles opened his wallet. He looked once more at Margaret's handwritten note. Never let success lock the door behind you. He quietly folded it closed. If Alice Graham walks through our doors, he smiled thoughtfully. Can't. She won't just change her own future. Karen looked curious. You think she'll change the company? Charles nodded with complete certainty. I think she'll remind everyone why the company existed in the first place. Neither of them realized that the greatest challenge awaiting Alice would not be learning logistics. It would be earning the respect of people who believed someone with a mop could never become a leader. And among those people, one name would soon stand above all the others: Ryan Coleman. Monday morning arrived with freezing rain instead of snow. Alice Graham stood outside Whitmore Logistics headquarters holding a borrowed navy blazer Mrs. Eleanor Price had insisted she wear. "It belonged to my daughter," the elderly woman had said while adjusting the sleeves. "Now it can bring another woman some luck." The blazer fit surprisingly well. The shoes did not. She had polished her only pair of black flats until they looked almost new, but the cracked leather still revealed their age whenever the light struck from the wrong angle. She took one slow breath before stepping through the revolving doors. The lobby she had cleaned dozens of times after midnight looked entirely different during business hours. Employees hurried across polished marble floors carrying laptops and coffee. Large digital displays tracked deliveries moving across North America. Executives greeted one another by name. Nobody recognized the woman who had once emptied trash cans after everyone went home. Karen Foster walked toward her with a welcoming smile. "Alice," Alice nodded. "Good morning." "I'm Karen." They shook hands. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." Karen studied her for a moment. "I imagine you're nervous." Alice laughed softly. "I've cleaned this building for months. I've just never been invited through the front door." Karen smiled. "Then let's change that." She led Alice through a secure hallway toward the executive offices. Along the way, curious employees glanced at the unfamiliar visitor. Some smiled politely, others barely noticed. One person, however, stopped walking entirely. Ryan Coleman. He looked from Alice to Karen, then back again. After Karen and Alice disappeared around the corner, Ryan frowned. He immediately recognized the woman from the background investigation. He also knew something few others did. Charles Whitmore had personally approved her entry into the management development program. Ryan wasn't convinced it was a wise decision. Inside a conference room overlooking the main distribution yard, Charles stood waiting. "Alice." "Mr. Whitmore." He shook her hand. "I'm happy you accepted." "I almost didn't." "What changed your mind?" She smiled. "My son asked whether I was afraid of failing or afraid of becoming someone new." Charles laughed quietly. "Children ask dangerous questions. They usually know the answer first." Karen handed Alice a folder. "Your schedule." Alice opened it. Every hour of the next 6 months had been carefully planned. Warehouse operations, fleet management, inventory control, customer service, safety compliance, financial reporting, leadership seminars. The amount of information seemed overwhelming. Charles noticed the expression on her face. "One day at a time," she nodded gratefully. "I'm assigning Karen as your primary mentor." Karen smiled. "And I'll be honest. There will be difficult days. I expect that. You'll make mistakes. I'm sure I will. That's allowed." Before the meeting ended, Charles added one more sentence. "You are not here because you returned my wallet." Alice looked surprised. "You're here because your character convinced me you're worth teaching." "I don't want special treatment." "You won't receive any." He smiled. "You'll learn everything from this point forward." The first stop was Warehouse 3. Rows of towering shelves stretched almost to the ceiling. Forklifts moved steadily between loading lanes. Hundreds of packages flowed through automated conveyor systems. Karen handed Alice a reflective safety vest. "For the next 3 weeks," she smiled. "You're not a trainee." "What am I? A warehouse associate." Alice blinked. "I thought management trainees observed." Karen shook her head. "Not here. You'll do every job before leading anyone who does it." Alice actually felt relieved. That made sense. The warehouse supervisor, Miguel Alvarez, greeted her warmly. "Charles told me you'd be joining us." He extended his hand. "We don't care where you came from. We care whether you're willing to work. I am. I figured. Miguel introduced her to the morning crew. Most welcomed her politely. One man did not. David Mercer, a forklift operator with 20 years of experience, looked her up and down. So, you're the famous wallet lady? Alice looked confused. I've heard the story. He shrugged. Returning a wallet doesn't teach logistics. No, she answered calmly. It doesn't. David seemed almost disappointed that she hadn't argued. Throughout the morning, Alice learned barcode scanners, pallet labeling, inventory verification, and shipping procedures. She asked questions constantly. She wrote detailed notes. Whenever she made a mistake, she admitted it immediately, instead of pretending she understood. Miguel quietly observed. By lunchtime, he turned to Karen. She learns fast. Karen smiled. She listens first. Across the cafeteria, Ryan Coleman watched from another table. A department manager sat beside him. So, that's her. Ryan nodded. The janitor. Former janitor. The manager shrugged. I still don't understand. Ryan lowered his voice. Neither do I. Meanwhile, Alice carried her lunch to an empty table. Before she could sit down, someone called her name. Mind if I join you? It was Linda Harris, another trainee. Unlike Alice, Linda held an MBA from Ohio State and had spent 3 years in supply chain consulting. Alice smiled. Of course. Linda opened her salad. I'll admit something. What? When I heard Charles personally selected someone, she hesitated. I expected an executive's daughter. Alice laughed. So did I. The tension disappeared immediately. For the next 30 minutes, they discussed training schedules instead of resumes. Linda noticed something unusual. You ask questions nobody else asks. Alice looked puzzled. Like what? This morning you asked why damaged boxes were photographed before disposal. I wanted to understand. Most trainees only ask how. You ask why. Alice smiled. I've spent years cleaning up problems. I like knowing how they started. Linda laughed. That's actually useful. Their conversation was interrupted when Karen approached. Alice. Yes. Charles wants everyone in conference room B. All 12 management trainees gathered. Charles stood beside a whiteboard. I'm not here to lecture. He looked around the room. I'm here to ask one question. Silence filled the room. What gives a leader credibility? Hands rose immediately. Experience. Results. Knowledge. Communication. Charles wrote every answer. Finally, he looked toward Alice. What do you think? Every eye in the room turned toward her. She hesitated. I don't know. Try. She looked down briefly before answering. I think... She chose her words carefully. People follow someone they trust. The room became quiet. Charles slowly nodded. And how did they decide whether to trust someone? Alice answered almost instinctively. They watch the small things. What small things? If you keep your word. If you admit mistakes. If you treat everyone the same. If you do what's right when nobody important is looking. Charles smiled. Exactly. He turned back toward the board. Everything else can be taught. No one realized he was repeating almost the exact conclusion he had reached after reading Ryan's investigation. When the session ended, Ryan remained standing near the doorway. Karen approached him. What do you think? Ryan crossed his arms. She's impressive. Karen smiled. But inspiring speeches don't run logistics. Karen nodded. No, they don't. Ryan looked through the glass wall toward the warehouse floor, where Alice was already helping another employee restack damaged cartons instead of waiting to be asked. "I'll reserve judgment." Karen followed his gaze. "Fair enough." Late that afternoon, Miguel gave Alice her final assignment before going home. A shipment report contained 3 inventory numbers that didn't match the physical count. Several experienced employees suggested simply correcting the spreadsheet. Instead, Alice asked a simple question. "Shouldn't we find out why they don't match first?" Miguel looked at her thoughtfully. Most new employees tried to solve the symptom. Very few questioned the cause. He smiled quietly. Perhaps Charles Whitmore had seen something that wasn't obvious to everyone else. Perhaps this training program wasn't built on hope after all. Perhaps it was built on potential waiting for the right opportunity. And in another part of the building, Ryan Coleman opened Alice Graham's personnel file once more. This time he wasn't looking for reasons she would fail. He was looking for the first mistake that would prove Charles had been wrong. He had no idea how long he would have to wait. 3 months into the leadership program, Alice Graham no longer looked like a visitor inside Whitmore Logistics. She wore the company uniform with quiet confidence. She knew the names of warehouse associates, dispatch coordinators, forklift mechanics, and customer service representatives. She still carried a small notebook in her pocket. Only now, instead of writing down unfamiliar terms, she filled it with observations. People waited longer than necessary because 2 scanners shared 1 charging station. Drivers often solved routing problems before supervisors even noticed them. Experienced warehouse workers knew which pallets were unstable simply by looking at the wrapping. Systems mattered. But people noticed problems first. Karen Foster saw the change. During their weekly review, she asked, "What's the biggest lesson you've learned so far?" Alice answered without hesitation. "Processes are written." Karen nodded. "And experience isn't," she continued. "The people who've been here 20 years carry knowledge no manual can teach." Karen smiled. "That's why good leaders listen before changing anything." Alice nodded. "I've been trying." "You have." That same afternoon, the opportunity to prove it arrived unexpectedly. At 2:17 p.m., Warehouse 3's receiving department suddenly fell behind schedule. A winter storm in Pennsylvania had delayed multiple freight trucks. When the roads finally reopened, 7 trailers arrived within 40 minutes instead of being spread across the afternoon. Loading docks filled almost instantly. Forklifts waited for space. Drivers grew impatient. Phone calls from customers began arriving. Miguel Alvarez frowned at the scheduling board. "This isn't good." Another supervisor looked at the growing line of trucks. "We'll work overtime." Miguel shook his head. "Not enough." Ryan Coleman happened to be walking through the warehouse during a routine inspection. He glanced at the backed-up loading bays. "What happened?" "Weather," Miguel answered. "Everything showed up at once." Ryan crossed his arms. "So now, we process as fast as possible." The atmosphere changed within minutes. Employees hurried. Forklifts crossed paths more frequently. Dispatch phones rang continuously. One frustrated driver argued with a dock coordinator. Another complained that his refrigerated shipment couldn't wait another hour. Karen arrived from headquarters. "Status," Miguel pointed toward the dock schedule. "We're almost 2 hours behind." Charles Whitmore, attending a regional conference across town, received a brief update but did not interfere. He trusted his managers. In the middle of the growing confusion, Alice quietly watched. She wasn't looking at the trucks. She was watching people. Every few minutes, she noticed something. 3 loading bays remained occupied by completed paperwork waiting for signatures. A quality inspection table sat empty because the inspector had been reassigned. 2 forklift operators were traveling unusually long distances because one temporary storage lane had been closed earlier that morning. None of those issues caused the problem. Together, they made it worse. Alice approached Miguel. "I think I see something." He looked exhausted. "What?" "The trucks aren't the bottleneck." He frowned. "Then what is—" She pointed toward the paperwork station. "We're waiting on signatures before clearing completed docks." Miguel looked. She was right. Finished trailers occupied valuable space while documents sat untouched. Alice continued. "If dispatch verifies electronically first." She spoke carefully. "The paperwork can follow." Ryan overheard the conversation. "That's not standard procedure." Alice nodded. "I know." Karen stepped closer. "Explain?" Alice walked them through everything she had observed. "If completed trailers leave immediately," she pointed toward the screen, Dock 2 and Dock 4 become available within 15 minutes. Then move quality inspection here temporarily." She pointed toward unused floor space closer to receiving. "The inspectors walk less. The forklift operators travel shorter routes. And refrigerated cargo unloads first." Ryan remained skeptical. "That's a lot of changes." Alice didn't argue. "It might not work." Miguel looked from the crowded warehouse to Alice, then back again. Finally, he made a decision. "We're trying it." Ryan frowned. "Based on one trainee's idea," Miguel answered calmly. "Based on good observations." The warehouse moved quickly. Supervisors reassigned 2 employees. Dispatch approved temporary electronic verification. Quality inspection relocated. Forklift routes changed. For 15 tense minutes, nobody knew whether the adjustments would help. Then something remarkable happened. The first waiting trailer pulled away. Another immediately backed into the open dock. Congestion eased. Forklift traffic became smoother. The line of waiting trucks began shrinking. By 4 o'clock, the backlog had dropped by nearly half. By 5:30, the warehouse was back on schedule. Miguel leaned against a railing, finally able to breathe normally. Karen checked the updated dashboard. "We recovered almost 90 minutes. Ryan stared silently at the screens. He replayed the afternoon in his mind. Alice hadn't shouted. She hadn't tried to impress anyone. She had simply watched carefully. Then spoken only after understanding the entire situation. Charles returned shortly before 6. He found the warehouse operating normally again. Miguel greeted him. "You missed the excitement." "So I heard." Charles smiled. "What happened?" Miguel explained everything from the delayed trucks to Alice's observations. Charles listened without interrupting. When the story ended, he asked only one question. "Who deserves the credit?" Miguel answered immediately. "The team." Then he smiled. "But Alice saw the problem before the rest of us." Charles looked across the warehouse. Alice was helping another employee restack damaged cartons instead of discussing what had happened. She wasn't telling anyone she had solved the crisis. She wasn't waiting for recognition. She had simply returned to work. Ryan approached Charles. "I owe you something." Charles looked at him. "I was wrong." Charles remained quiet. Ryan continued. "I thought she succeeded because people wanted your approval." He glanced toward Alice. "But today," he shook his head, "nobody followed her because of you. They followed her because she made sense." Charles smiled gently. "That's leadership." Ryan nodded. "I see that now." Later that evening, Karen found Alice finishing inventory reports. "You handled yourself well today." Alice looked up. "I wasn't sure anyone agreed." Karen laughed. "Miguel certainly did." Alice closed the notebook. "I almost didn't say anything." "Why?" I kept thinking, she hesitated. What if I'm wrong? Karen sat beside her. Do you know why your suggestion worked? Alice shrugged. I paid attention. Karen smiled. No? You respected the people doing the work. Alice looked puzzled. What do you mean? You didn't assume they were making mistakes. You assumed the system was making their jobs harder. Alice thought about that. She hadn't realized it. Karen stood. That's a rare instinct. After everyone else had left, Charles walked through the quiet warehouse alone. The evening shift had already taken over. Conveyors hummed steadily. Packages moved smoothly toward outbound trailers. He stopped beside Dock 4. Months earlier, this had simply been another loading bay. Today, it reminded him of something Margaret often said. Good leaders don't need to be the smartest person in the room. They need to create rooms where the smartest ideas can be heard. He smiled. Alice Graham had done exactly that, not by demanding authority, by earning attention. The next morning, company-wide performance reports landed on executive desks. One note, attached by Miguel, read simply, Yesterday's recovery prevented multiple delayed deliveries. Recommendation document revised emergency dock procedure. At the bottom, someone had handwritten another sentence. Original observation credited to management trainee Alice Graham. Charles read it once, then folded the report into his notebook beside Margaret's handwritten message. For the first time since beginning the program, he felt certain he had not merely recruited an honest employee. He had discovered a future leader. And very soon, Alice would finally learn why the tiny brass key inside his wallet had always meant far more than opening a forgotten apartment door. The leadership program reached its 6th and final month, just as spring began to replace Cleveland's gray winter. The trees outside Whitmore Logistics headquarters showed the first hints of green. Employees opened windows during lunch breaks. The loading docks buzzed with renewed energy. For Alice Graham, the change in season reflected something deeper. She no longer walked through the building wondering whether she belonged. She had earned that answer. Not because Charles Whitmore had believed in her, because hundreds of co-workers now trusted her judgment. Forklift operators greeted her by name. Dispatch coordinators asked for her opinion. Warehouse supervisors invited her into planning meetings without being prompted. Respect had arrived quietly. Exactly the way trust always did. One Friday afternoon, Karen Foster stopped by Alice's workstation. Charles wants to see you. Alice smiled. Did I forget another meeting? Karen shook her head. No. This one's different. They walked together toward the executive floor. Instead of entering the boardroom, Karen led her to Charles's private office. The room overlooked the company's original warehouse, still preserved despite decades of expansion. Charles stood beside the window holding a small wooden box. Alice? She smiled. You wanted to see me? I did. He motioned towards 2 chairs. Sit. She noticed there were no reports on his desk. No schedules, no performance evaluations, only the small box. Charles remained quiet for a few moments before speaking. Do you know why I started this company? She thought for a second. To build a logistics business. He smiled. That's what we became. But no. He opened the wooden box. Inside lay the tiny brass key she had seen the morning she returned his wallet. He held it gently in his palm. You asked Ethan what this key opened. Alice nodded. You said it opened your first apartment. It did. He turned the worn brass key between his fingers. When Margaret and I moved into that apartment, he smiled at the memory. We owned 1 table, 2 folding chairs, a mattress on the floor, and exactly 1 delivery van. Alice listened silently. The apartment wasn't beautiful. The neighborhood certainly wasn't. But every night we locked that door feeling like the richest people alive. Because it was ours. His voice softened. We built this company while living there. Every invoice, every payroll, every impossible decision, every failure. They all began behind the door this key once opened. Alice looked at the small piece of brass differently now. It isn't valuable because of the metal. Charles nodded. Exactly. It's valuable because of the promises attached to it. He handed her the key. She accepted it carefully. It feels lighter than I expected. It always does. He smiled. The weight comes from the memories. Alice studied the worn edges. Years of use had smoothed every corner. What happened after your wife passed away? Charles looked toward the window again. I almost retired. You did? I didn't think I could continue. What changed your mind? He smiled sadly. I found one of Margaret's notebooks. Alice waited. Inside, she had written something. He opened another folded paper from the wooden box. Different handwriting, different page, same careful elegance. She had written, "One day this company will be too large for us to know everyone's name. Promise me we will never become too successful to notice good people." Charles folded the paper slowly. I've tried to keep that promise. Alice looked from the note to the brass key. So that's why you investigated me. He laughed. Partly. I wanted to know whether I had found someone Margaret would have noticed. Alice smiled quietly. I've never met her. No? But she would have liked you. For the first time since entering the office, Alice's eyes became moist. Thank you. Charles leaned back. Do you know why I never insisted you accept the $50,000? I think so. Tell me. Because it would have solved my bills. She looked at him. But not my future. Charles smiled. You understand? He continued. I could have written a check. You would have been grateful. For a while. He paused. But an opportunity changes generations. Alice thought of Ethan, his asthma medication, his school, his growing confidence. She understood exactly what Charles meant. There was a gentle knock on the office door. Karen entered. Sorry to interrupt. You asked me to remind you. Charles looked at the clock. Right. He stood. Come with me. The three walked downstairs to the original warehouse. Most employees had already gathered there without Alice realizing why. Managers, drivers, warehouse associates, office staff, nearly everyone from headquarters. Miguel smiled when he saw her. Linda waved enthusiastically. Even Ryan stood near the front. Charles stepped onto a small platform. I'll keep this brief. The conversations faded into silence. 6 months ago, he looked toward Alice. We welcomed someone into our leadership development program. A person with no corporate experience, no business degree, no executive title. He smiled. What she did have was something far rarer. He paused. Character. Alice immediately realized what was happening. She wished she could disappear. Charles continued. During these 6 months, she has asked better questions than many executives. She has listened before speaking, learned before leading, and earned the respect of people who had every reason to doubt her. He looked toward Miguel. Miguel. The warehouse supervisor nodded. I'd trust her with my team. Charles turned towards Ryan. Ryan smiled openly. I was wrong about her. I admit it. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Ryan continued. She earned every bit of my respect. Charles looked back at Alice. I believe leadership begins when trust outweighs authority. He reached into his pocket, then held up the tiny brass key. This key has stayed in my wallet for 32 years. The room grew completely silent. It reminds me where this company began. My wife believed symbols matter. So do I. He looked directly at Alice. I'm not giving you this key. She blinked, slightly surprised. I'm showing it to you because you've earned the story behind it. He slipped it back into his wallet. The key remains with me. The responsibility it represents, he smiled warmly, is now something we share. He extended another envelope. This time Alice accepted it. Inside was not a check. It was an official appointment letter. Regional Operations Manager, effective immediately. The room erupted into applause. Alice stared at the document. She looked up. For once, words failed her. Charles rescued her with a smile. You don't have to make a speech. She laughed through tears. Good. Because I didn't prepare one. Miguel started clapping harder. Soon everyone joined. Linda hugged her. Karen smiled proudly. Ryan walked over last. He extended his hand. I owe you an apology. Alice shook it. You don't. I judged your resume. He smiled. I should have paid attention to your actions. She answered gently. We've both been learning. Ryan laughed. I suppose we have. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended, Alice returned home. Ethan rushed to the door. How did it go? Instead of answering, she handed him the appointment letter. He read it twice, then looked up with the biggest smile she had ever seen. You did it. She hugged him tightly. No, she whispered. We did. Outside the apartment window, the setting sun painted the city in warm gold. Far away, Charles Whitmore sat alone in his office. He touched the brass key resting inside his wallet. For the first time in many years, he felt that Margaret's promise had not merely been remembered. It had been passed to someone worthy of carrying it forward. And one day when the time was right, the little brass key itself would find its next guardian. Alice Graham's promotion changed many things. It did not change her morning routine. She still woke before sunrise. She still prepared Ethan's breakfast before getting ready for work. She still checked his inhaler before he left for school. Only now, instead of putting on a diner uniform, she buttoned a Navy Whitmore logistics jacket with the words Regional Operations Manager embroidered beneath her name. The title felt unfamiliar. Responsibility did not. On her first official day in the new role, she arrived nearly 45 minutes early. Old habits were difficult to abandon. Miguel Alvarez laughed when he saw her standing beside the warehouse entrance before sunrise. You know you're the manager now. Alice smiled. I do. You don't have to unlock the building. I know. Then why are you here? She looked across the loading yard where the first trucks were already arriving. I wanted to remember what this place feels like before everyone starts asking me for answers. Miguel nodded thoughtfully. Never lose that. Within an hour, her calendar filled with meetings, budget reviews, safety reports, delivery performance, customer satisfaction metrics, regional staffing. It was far different from stacking pallets or checking inventory. Yet one thing quickly became obvious. Every report represented real people. Every number represented someone's work. Karen Foster joined her for the first executive planning meeting. Around the conference table sat department heads with decades of experience. Several had quietly questioned whether Alice was ready. None voiced it aloud. Charles Whitmore entered last. Let's begin. The first discussion focused on quarterly operating costs. The finance director proposed reducing overtime by limiting weekend maintenance crews. On paper, the savings looked impressive. Several executives nodded. Before the vote, Charles looked toward Alice. Any thoughts? She hesitated. The room fell silent. I might be missing something. The finance director smiled politely. Go ahead. Alice opened her notebook. I spent 3 weeks working with maintenance. She looked toward the director. If we reduce weekend preventive repairs, she pointed towards the equipment report. Forklift failures will probably increase during weekdays. The director frowned. Our projections don't show that. No, Alice agreed. They show repair costs. She turned another page. They don't show delayed shipments. Miguel quietly smiled from across the table. Alice continued. When a forklift breaks during peak loading, she looked around the room. The delay spreads to receiving dispatch drivers, customer service, and eventually the customer. She wasn't speaking from theory. She had lived those days on the warehouse floor. The room grew quiet. Charles finally asked, What do you recommend? Reduce unnecessary overtime. She answered. But protect preventive maintenance. Saving $10,000 today? She smiled slightly. It's expensive if it creates $50,000 of delays next month. The finance director slowly leaned back. I hadn't considered the operational impact. Charles looked around the table. That's exactly why different experience matters. The proposal was revised. After the meeting ended, several executives approached Alice, not to congratulate her, to ask questions. That mattered more. Weeks passed. Under Alice's leadership, warehouse managers began holding 15-minute morning discussions with frontline employees before each shift. Not speeches, conversations. Employees suggested improvements nobody at headquarters had noticed. One driver proposed changing delivery paperwork for nursing homes. A warehouse associate redesigned pallet labels to reduce scanning errors. A janitor recommended moving cleaning supplies closer to loading docks, saving dozens of unnecessary trips each day. Each suggestion was tested. Many succeeded. Ryan Coleman visited one afternoon. He watched Alice listening while a part-time forklift operator explained a loading problem. After the meeting ended, Ryan smiled. You know? What? When I first met you, I thought you were trying to become an executive. Alice laughed. I was trying not to get fired. Ryan laughed too. I've realized something. She waited. You still think like the people doing the work. I hope I always will. Ryan nodded. So do I. At home, life slowly became easier. The overdue bills disappeared. The old car was replaced with a dependable used sedan. Ethan's asthma medication was always available before the prescription ran out. For the first time in years, Alice opened a savings account. Yet she refused to move immediately. Mrs. Eleanor Price noticed. You could afford somewhere nicer now. Alice smiled. I probably could. So why stay? Alice looked around the familiar apartment building. Because home isn't only where you sleep. The elderly woman smiled knowingly. Several months later, Charles invited Alice to lunch. Not at an expensive restaurant. At the original neighborhood diner where Whitmore Logistics employees had eaten decades earlier. The waitress recognized Charles immediately. The usual? He smiled. Please. Alice looked around the modest restaurant. I expected somewhere fancier. Charles laughed. I come here when I need perspective. After lunch arrived, he asked, Are you happy? Alice thought carefully. I'm grateful. That's not the same thing. She smiled. No, it isn't. He waited. I'm happy because I still recognize myself. Charles nodded with quiet approval. I worried about that. You did. I've watched success change people. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes overnight. Alice stirred her coffee. My life changed. But the reason I returned your wallet didn't. Charles smiled. Good. He reached into his coat. For a brief moment she wondered whether the brass key would appear again. Instead, he produced another folded paper. A new program. She read the proposal. Employee Character Recognition Initiative. It rewarded acts of honesty, responsibility, and service rather than sales numbers alone. She looked up. This was Margaret's idea. Charles smiled. Originally. You finished it? No. He shook his head. You reminded me it still mattered. Alice looked down at the proposal again. We are recognizing kindness. We are recognizing character, he corrected gently. They aren't always the same. She smiled. No, they aren't. Several weeks later, the program launched company-wide. Employees could nominate coworkers for quiet acts that usually went unnoticed, returning lost property, helping teammates, protecting customers, owning mistakes honestly. Within days, nominations flooded in. None involved dramatic heroics. Most described ordinary moments, exactly the kind of moments Alice herself had lived for years. One evening, Ethan sat beside his mother while she reviewed nomination letters at the kitchen table. He smiled. People do lots of good things. They do, Alice answered. Then why don't we hear about them? She looked thoughtfully at the stack of papers. Because good people usually aren't trying to become famous. He nodded. I like that. So do I. Across town, Charles closed another successful quarterly report. Profits had increased, customer satisfaction had improved. Employee turnover had fallen to the lowest level in company history. Yet the numbers themselves weren't what pleased him most. On his desk rested dozens of handwritten stories submitted through the new recognition program. Stories of honesty, responsibility, compassion, integrity. Margaret had once dreamed of building a company where character mattered as much as performance. Now that dream had finally become part of the culture. Charles opened his wallet once more. The tiny brass key rested beside Margaret's folded note. He smiled quietly. One day, he thought. Not today, but one day. This key would no longer belong to the past. It would become a promise carried into the future by someone who truly understood what it represented. He already knew exactly who that person would be. He simply needed to wait until the right moment. Nearly 2 years passed. Whitmore Logistics continued to grow, but Charles Whitmore noticed something that pleased him more than rising profits. The stories. Every month, the Character Recognition Initiative produced dozens of handwritten accounts from employees across the company. A mechanic who repaired a stranded driver's truck on his day off. A receptionist who quietly paid for a visitor's taxi after the man's wallet was stolen. A warehouse associate who admitted causing an expensive shipping mistake before anyone discovered it. None of those stories appeared in financial reports. Yet Charles read every one. One Saturday morning, Alice Graham wasn't thinking about work at all. She and 13-year-old Ethan were shopping for groceries at a neighborhood supermarket. The refrigerator at home had finally stopped making strange noises after years of faithful service. But Ethan insisted they celebrate by buying ingredients for homemade pancakes. "You're getting fancy," Alice laughed. "We're buying blueberries." Exactly. As they walked through the parking lot carrying reusable grocery bags, Ethan suddenly stopped. "Mom." "What is it?" He pointed toward a shopping cart sitting alone near the edge of the lot. A worn backpack rested inside. No one appeared nearby. Alice looked around. Maybe someone forgot it. They waited several minutes. Still no one came. Ethan carefully lifted the backpack. "It's pretty heavy. Let's see if there's identification." Inside were school books, a science notebook, a lunch container, an inhaler, and a small envelope containing nearly $400 in cash. Alice immediately zipped the bag closed. "Someone must be terrified right now." Ethan nodded. "What do we do?" She smiled. The same thing we always do. The supermarket manager checked the security cameras. Within minutes, they identified a frightened father running through the parking lot, searching desperately between parked cars. His young son followed behind him, crying uncontrollably. When the father entered the customer service desk, he looked exhausted. "I'm looking for my son's backpack." His voice shook. "It has his medicine. And money for his school trip." The manager smiled. "I think someone has something for you." Alice stepped forward, holding the backpack. The father's shoulders visibly relaxed. "Oh, thank God." He hugged his son tightly before opening the bag. Everything remained exactly where he had left it. The envelope, the inhaler, the homework. Nothing was missing. "I don't know how to thank you." Alice smiled. "You already have." The man looked confused. "My son's smiling again." The father insisted on offering part of the cash as a reward. Alice politely declined. Just then, Ethan gently touched his mother's sleeve. "Can I?" She smiled. "Of course." Ethan stepped toward the younger boy. "I almost lost my backpack once." The little boy sniffled. "Really?" "Yeah. My mom says people make mistakes," he smiled, "but good people help fix them." The younger boy nodded slowly. "I'll be more careful." "I know." The father shook Ethan's hand. "Young man." He smiled warmly. "You've got a wonderful mother," Ethan answered proudly. "I know." Neither Alice nor Ethan noticed someone watching quietly from the far side of the parking lot. Charles Whitmore. He had stopped at the supermarket after visiting a nearby community center. From inside his parked SUV, he had witnessed nearly everything. Michael Reed, his longtime driver, smiled. "Looks familiar." Charles laughed softly. "Very." "They didn't know you were here." "I preferred it that way." Michael watched Ethan speaking kindly to the younger child. "Looks like honesty became contagious." Charles nodded. "No. It became inheritance." Back at home that afternoon, Ethan placed the pancake mix on the kitchen counter. Alice looked at him. "You handled yourself well." He shrugged. "I copied you." "No," she smiled. "You made your own choice." He thought for a moment. "Do you think that boy will remember today?" "I hope so." "What if he doesn't?" Alice poured flour into a mixing bowl. "Then maybe his father will." She paused. "And sometimes that's enough." Monday morning, Charles invited Alice to lunch again. This time she immediately noticed the smile on his face. "You look like you're hiding something." He laughed. "Maybe." After they ordered, he asked casually, "How was your weekend?" She smiled. "Quiet. Grocery shopping. Pancakes. Ethan convinced me blueberries belong in everything." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Anything else happen?" She shrugged. "We found a lost backpack." Charles smiled wider. "I heard." Alice blinked. "You heard I happened to be there?" She laughed in disbelief. "I had no idea." "I know." He leaned back. "Do you know what impressed me most?" "It wasn't me." "No." He smiled. "It was Ethan." Alice's expression softened. "He never hesitated." Charles nodded. "He didn't even look at you before deciding to help." She thought about it. "You're right. He already knew what to do." Charles folded his hands. "That's the difference between teaching rules," he smiled, "and teaching values." She nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that." "About what?" "When I returned your wallet," she looked out the restaurant window, "I thought I was teaching Ethan one lesson." She smiled. "I didn't realize I was teaching him how to make every future decision." Charles remained quiet. Sometimes silence respected important truths better than words. After lunch, Charles asked Alice to walk with him. Instead of returning directly to headquarters, they crossed the street to a small public park. Children played near the swings. Parents sat on benches. An elderly man fed pigeons. Charles looked around. My wife loved parks. She said you learn everything about society by watching how strangers treat one another. Alice smiled. She sounds wise. She usually was. He reached into his pocket. For a brief moment, Alice wondered if he was carrying the brass key again. Instead, he removed a small photograph. It showed a much younger Charles and Margaret standing beside an old delivery van. Both were laughing. The tiny apartment building stood behind them. The day we bought our first truck. Alice smiled. You both look so happy. We were. He pointed toward Margaret. She insisted on one company rule before we hired our first employee. What was it? If someone makes the company richer. He paused. Reward them. If someone makes the company better. He smiled. Never let them leave. Alice laughed softly. So that's why you never accepted my resignation after the training program ended. I had no intention of letting you leave. They both laughed. As they prepared to return, Charles looked toward the playground, where two children were helping a younger girl climb onto a swing. You know, he said quietly, companies don't really shape communities. Alice looked at him. Families do. She immediately thought of Ethan, then of the frightened little boy in the supermarket parking lot, then of her own mother who had taught her decades earlier that keeping what wasn't yours always cost more than it gained. Some lessons traveled farther than anyone realized. Back at headquarters, Karen handed Alice the quarterly employee recognition report. The final nomination caught her attention. Submitted anonymously. Reason for nomination. A young boy who returned a lost school backpack without expecting anything in return. The witness wrote only one final sentence. Character doesn't retire. It reproduces itself. Alice smiled before quietly placing the report into her desk drawer. She knew exactly who had written it. And she had a feeling Charles Whitmore had something even more meaningful planned for Ethan's future. 3 years after the night Alice Graham returned a stranger's lost wallet, Whitmore Logistics had become known for something competitors struggled to understand. Its employees stayed. Turnover dropped year after year. Customers consistently rated the company among the most trusted in the region. Business magazines credited efficient operations. Consultants praised innovative management. Charles Whitmore smiled whenever he read those articles. They weren't wrong. They simply weren't complete. The company's greatest advantage had never appeared on a balance sheet. It was culture. And culture had a face. Alice. One Monday morning, Charles called an executive meeting. Around the conference table sat senior managers from every regional office. Alice noticed something unusual. A velvet-covered display stood near the projector screen. Charles waited until everyone settled into their seats. I'd like to announce a new tradition. The room grew quiet. He looked around before continuing. Many companies recognize sales. Others reward innovation. Some celebrate years of service. He smiled. Those things matter. But today we're honoring something even more important. He removed the velvet cloth. Beneath it rested a polished walnut case. Inside lay 12 handcrafted brass keys. Each looked identical to the one Charles had carried in his wallet for decades. Several executives exchanged curious glances. Alice stared silently. Charles gently lifted one key. When my wife and I started this company, he held it between his fingers. This little key opened the door to our first apartment. It reminded us where we came from. It reminded us that character mattered before success. He looked across the room. For 35 years, I've carried the original. He smiled. Today, we're beginning something new. He placed the key back into the case. The Earn the Key program. Karen Foster looked toward Alice with a knowing smile. Charles continued. These are not awards. They are responsibilities. No one can apply. No one can purchase one. No one receives one for making the company money. The room became completely silent. A key is entrusted only to people whose character changes the lives of others. He paused. And every recipient must someday choose another worthy person. One executive raised his hand. How many will be given each year? Charles smiled. As few as necessary. The meeting ended with applause, but Alice remained unusually quiet. After everyone else left, Charles called her back into the room. I was wondering how long it would take. She smiled. You knew I'd stay. I did. She looked toward the wooden display. You made copies. I had them handcrafted. They're beautiful. Charles nodded. The original still stays with me. She smiled. As it should. He reached into the display. Instead of handing her a key, he closed the case again. Not today. She looked surprised. I wasn't expecting one. I know, he smiled. I want you to see something first. Later that afternoon, Charles asked Alice to accompany him to the company's annual community volunteer event. Employees packed food boxes for local families, drivers delivered school supplies, mechanics repaired bicycles donated to neighborhood children. No cameras, no media coverage, just volunteers. As they walked through the community center, dozens of employees greeted Alice. A warehouse associate introduced her to his daughter. A dispatcher thanked her for listening during a difficult family crisis months earlier. A janitor proudly showed Alice a photograph of his son wearing a college graduation gown. You wrote his scholarship recommendation, he said quietly. I'll never forget it. Alice smiled. He earned it. Throughout the afternoon, Charles barely spoke. He simply watched. Near the end of the event, a teenage volunteer accidentally knocked over several boxes filled with canned food. The loud crash echoed through the room. Embarrassed, the boy froze. Several people looked over. Before anyone else moved, Alice knelt beside him. It's all right. She smiled. Let's fix it together. Within seconds, half a dozen employees joined her without being asked. No criticism, no blame, just helping hands. The frightened teenager relaxed immediately. Charles quietly looked at Karen. Do you see it? Karen smiled. They're copying her. No, Charles corrected gently. They're copying what she taught them. That evening, after the volunteers finished cleaning, Charles invited Alice to the quiet courtyard behind company headquarters. The sun was beginning to set. Orange light reflected from the office windows. He finally reached into his pocket. This time it was the original brass key, not a copy. The original. He placed it gently into Alice's hand. She looked at him in surprise. I thought... So did I. He smiled. But today changed my mind. She stared at the worn brass key. I can't take this. Yes. He answered softly. You can. This belongs to your history. It belongs to our future now. She immediately tried handing it back. I don't deserve this. Charles laughed quietly. That's exactly why you do. She looked down at the tiny key. I don't even know what to say. Then don't, he smiled. Just promise me one thing. What? Never let success lock the door behind you. Alice looked up. Margaret's words, the same sentence written on the folded note she had seen years earlier. She nodded slowly. I promise. Charles closed her fingers around the key. It isn't yours because you returned my wallet. It isn't yours because you became a manager. It isn't yours because profits improved. He smiled warmly. It's yours because people become better after meeting you. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze moved gently through the trees. Finally, Alice asked, "What happens now?" Charles looked toward the headquarters building where employees were laughing together as they carried volunteer supplies back inside. "Now," he smiled, "one day you'll know when it's time to pass it on." That night, Alice placed the brass key inside a small wooden box at home. She did not display it. She did not tell anyone. Even Ethan noticed only the box. "What's inside?" he asked. Alice smiled. "A promise." He looked confused. "What kind of promise? The kind you spend your whole life keeping?" He accepted that answer. As he walked upstairs to finish his homework, Alice quietly opened the box one more time. The little brass key looked exactly as it had the night she first saw it, inside Charles Whitmore's wallet. Only now its meaning had changed. Years earlier, it had represented one family's beginning. Now it represented a responsibility carried from one generation of character to the next. And although neither Alice nor Charles realized it yet, the next person worthy of receiving that promise was already growing into the kind of young man who would never ask what a reward was worth before deciding to do the right thing. His name was Ethan Graham. 5 years after a tired, single mother walked into a police station with a stranger's wallet, Whitmore Logistics celebrated its 40th anniversary. Employees from every regional office gathered at the original Cleveland headquarters. The oldest warehouse had been transformed into an event hall, but Charles Whitmore insisted on leaving one brick wall untouched. "This," he often said, "is what success should look back at." Photographs from the company's history covered the walls. The first delivery van, the tiny apartment where Charles and Margaret had lived, early warehouse crews, drivers standing proudly beside worn trucks. Near the entrance, another display quietly attracted everyone's attention. Instead of trophies or financial awards, it contained handwritten stories submitted through the Character Recognition Initiative. Stories of honesty, stories of courage, stories of ordinary people choosing to do the right thing when nobody expected them to. Alice Graham walked through the exhibit with Ethan. Now 18 years old, Ethan stood taller than his mother. The asthma that had once controlled so much of his childhood had become manageable through years of treatment. He had recently been accepted into a university engineering program supported in part by a Whitmore Foundation scholarship he had earned through academic excellence and community service. He stopped in front of one framed story. "Mom." She turned. The story described an unnamed woman who had returned a lost wallet in the middle of the night years earlier. No names, no photographs, only the lesson. Integrity is doing the right thing before anyone knows your name. Ethan smiled. "They never changed it." Alice shook her head. "It was never supposed to be about me." "It never was," a familiar voice answered from behind. Charles Whitmore. His hair had grown almost completely white, but his eyes carried the same quiet warmth they had the night he first knocked on Alice's apartment door. He looked at Ethan. "I hear congratulations are in order." Ethan smiled. "Thank you, sir." "Engineering?" "Yes." Charles nodded. "The world always needs people who know how to build." He glanced toward Alice. "And people who know why." The celebration officially began an hour later. Employees filled every seat. Families sat together. Retired drivers returned for the occasion. Several former warehouse associates brought grandchildren. Karen Foster opened the ceremony. Miguel Alvarez followed with stories that made everyone laugh. Ryan Coleman admitted to another round of laughter that he was still grateful Alice had proven him wrong. Finally, Charles approached the podium. The room became silent. 40 years ago, he began, my wife and I believed a company could succeed without sacrificing its values. He looked around the room. I stand here today knowing she was right. He spoke about growth, about customers, about employees who had devoted decades of their lives to the business. Then he paused. "I'd like to tell one final story." Many people smiled. They already knew which story was coming. 5 years ago, he continued, someone returned a wallet. A quiet laugh spread across the audience. "It would be easy to believe this story is about honesty." He shook his head. "It isn't. It is about what honesty creates." He looked directly at Alice. "A single decision made after midnight changed a company." He turned toward the employees. "Not because a wallet came home, but because a person revealed who she already was." His voice became softer. "When we reward character instead of simply admiring it." He smiled. "Character multiplies." The audience applauded. Charles waited for the room to grow quiet again. "I have one final responsibility today." He reached into his jacket pocket. Every person in the room recognized the movement. The original brass key. Its surface had become even smoother with time. Charles held it gently in his hand. "When Margaret gave me this key all those years ago," he said quietly, "she asked me never to let success lock the door behind us." He looked toward Alice. "I promised." He stepped away from the podium. Instead of asking Alice to come forward, he walked down from the stage himself. The room watched in complete silence. He stopped in front of her. "You've carried this promise faithfully." Alice shook her head. "I've only tried." "Exactly." He smiled. "You never believed you had finished." He placed the brass key into her hand once again. Only this time he did not take it back. "It belongs with you now." Tears filled Alice's eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever deserve it," Charles answered with the same words he had spoken years earlier. "Keep thinking that." The audience stood together in a long ovation, not because of the key, because they understood what it represented. After the ceremony ended, people gathered throughout the warehouse sharing memories. Children explored the displays. Retired employees reunited outside the evening sun settled over Cleveland. Alice stepped into the quiet courtyard carrying the small wooden box that now held the brass key. Ethan joined her. For several minutes, they simply watched families talking and laughing through the open windows. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When will you give the key to someone else?" Alice looked down at the box. "I don't know." He smiled. "I thought maybe—" She laughed softly. "I know what you're thinking." "You do? You think one day it should come to you?" He looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean—" She gently squeezed his shoulder. "And one day it might." She paused. "But not because you're my son." He nodded. "I know. You'll have to earn the story behind it." He smiled. "I'd rather earn it." She looked at him proudly. "I was hoping you'd say that." A few moments later, Charles slowly walked into the courtyard. He seemed content simply watching them together. "I think I've interrupted something." Alice smiled. "Not at all." Charles looked at Ethan. "Your mother once taught me something." Ethan looked surprised. "My mother," Charles nodded. "I believed I had rewarded integrity." He smiled. "She taught me that opportunity is a far greater gift than money." He turned toward Alice. "You changed more than this company. You changed me." Alice shook her head gently. "We changed each other." Charles laughed. "Fair enough." As darkness settled over the city, employees gradually headed home. The original warehouse grew quiet once more. Only the old brick walls remained silently holding decades of memories. Before leaving, Alice walked back inside one final time. She stopped beneath the framed story about the lost wallet. For a moment, she considered asking that her name finally be added. Instead, she smiled, and left it exactly as it was. Some stories became stronger when they belonged to everyone. Outside, she took Ethan's arm as they walked toward their car. Years ago, they had worried about rent medicine and tomorrow's meal. Tonight, they walked toward a future built not on luck, but on thousands of ordinary choices made with extraordinary integrity. Far behind them, the lights inside Whitmore Logistics slowly turned off one by one. Yet the promise that had begun with a tiny brass key, a folded note, and one honest decision made after midnight would continue shining in the lives of every person who chose to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. Every life is shaped by moments that seem ordinary at the time, returning a lost wallet, telling the truth when no one is watching. Offering kindness without expecting anything in return. These choices rarely make headlines, but they quietly shape our future and the lives of people around us. Alice never imagined that one honest decision would open a door she never knew existed. Yet the greatest reward was never the promotion, the success, or even the brass key. It was the realization that character is a legacy. Money can solve today's problems, but integrity builds tomorrow's opportunities. The values we practice become the lessons our children inherit, our co-workers remember, and our communities pass forward. In a world that often measures people by wealth status or influence, this story reminds us that our true worth is revealed by the decisions we make when no one is applauding. Success earned through honesty lasts longer than success gained through shortcuts, and a single act of integrity can create a ripple that reaches far beyond anything we can see. Never underestimate the power of doing the right thing. Someone may forget your name, but they will never forget how your character changed their life. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if you had found that wallet? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. We read every one of them. And if you believe stories like this remind us that kindness, honesty, and compassion still matter, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next inspiring story. Until next time, keep choosing kindness, because the smallest act of integrity may become the greatest turning point in someone's life.